Ecosystems, nutrient cycles, and the human impact on the environment. So you need to know about feeding relationships. So it's not too complicated. The overall thing you need to know is what producers, consumers, predators, prey, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, decomposers, and also what the trophic level is. So basically, a producer is what makes the it basically makes food that other animals eat. Like plants, they grow leaves. Well, yeah, plants. Plants is a good example. You have carrots, you have all sorts of vegetables, all sorts of like flora and fauna. So those would be producers, because they're a living organism that makes food using light or chemical energy. So plants make light, some use chemical energy. Plants and some bacteria, yeah, as I said, use light energy, while other bacteria use chemical energy. So that is what a producer is. They make food using light or chemical energy, and usually they're at the sort of at the bottom of the food chain. And then you have consumers, which get energy by consuming food, which would be the producers. So it would go producers, which make the food, and then it would be consumers, and then you have both primary consumers. It just sort of goes primary consumers, secondary consumers. You can also have tertiary consumers, which is just the third one. And a trophic level is basically, well, the definition is a group of organisms that occupy the same position in the food chain. It can also be called a feeding level. So in this system, this food chain would have 1, 2, 3, 4 feeding or trophic levels. Usually, well, secondary and tertiary consumers are predators, which you are familiar with. They're just organisms that hunt other organisms. And primary consumers tend to be prey, which would be an organism that is hunted by other organisms. Like, for an example, a rabbit would be, well, a rabbit might, let me look at the diet of a rabbit. Well, for the sake of the argument, let's say rabbits don't eat insects. They can if they want to, but let's say they just eat carrots. So you have carrot, which would be the producer, is making its own food from light, from its leaves, and it gets eaten by the primary consumer, which would be a rabbit, which would be, in this instance, a herbivore, and also prey, because it's preyed on by, let's say, a hawk. Hawks would be the secondary consumer, and this food chain would have three feeding levels or trophic levels. Omnivores, like humans, eat both vegetables, things they don't hunt, and things that they do. So just plants and animals, omnivores eat. Carnivores only eat other animals, and herbivores only eat plants. In food chains like this, the arrow represents the transfer of energy. So while you may think, oh, because a rabbit eats a carrot, you do that because it's attacking the carrot, essentially. But that's not how it works. The arrows represent the transfer of energy. So the energy is transferred from the carrot to the rabbit, from the rabbit to the hawk. Yeah. And this energy is used in the repair, maintenance, and growth of cells, as well as movement and reproduction. Some is wasted on heat during respiration, but yeah. So you get pyramids of both numbers and biomass. So a pyramid of a number shows the number of organisms per unit area or volume at each feeding level, and it can be of an irregular shape, not a pyramid. So yeah, and pyramids of biomass show the dry mass of organic material per unit area or volume at each feeding level, and it's always a pyramidal shape. So the base layer would represent the producers, and then it would be the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So here, with the number of producers, there's more producers than there are primary consumers. Then there's more primary consumers than there are secondary consumers, but there's a lot of tertiary consumers. So yeah. But for this one, this just shows how much mass there is. There's always going to be more producers, like trees and plants. There's lots of them compared to that of primary consumers like rabbits, and that compared to secondary consumers like hogs, and then that compared to tertiary consumers like, I was going to say a lion. Wouldn't usually see a lion around here, but I'll say something like that. The example they gave was oak trees, caterpillars, blue tits, and sparrowhawks. Obviously not always a pyramidal shape. So, to calculate the efficiency of energy transfers in a food chain, just, how much energy actually transfers from one organism to another when they get eaten. This is only for higher tier, but it would be efficiency equals energy in later stage over energy in earlier stage times 100. Sorry, that's the other way around for some reason. It would actually be the energy in earlier stage over energy in later stage. I'm not sure why I've corrected it in the book, but I have for some reason. Anyway, so for the example, if we were to calculate the efficiency of energy transfer for the first stage consumers, you'd get the energy of in the earlier stage, which would be 7,000, the stage before, and then you do that over 97,000, which is the later stage. So it's basically seeing how much of this is moved into this. No, that's a bad way of explaining it. What we know is that 7,000 kilojoules of energy has been transferred from 907,000 kilojoules of energy, and all we're doing is figuring out the percentage of 7,000 out of 97,000. And if you put that into your calculator and times it by 100, then you get 70.216%. I'll just do 22%. Yeah, it's just, as you know, that only 7,000 kilojoules was gained by the first stage consumer when they ate the producer, then you can figure out how much the percentage of that compared to the total percent of 100%, which would be 97,000 kilojoules. And that's just how efficient the transfer of energy is. I also forgot to mention decomposers. They are just bacteria and fungi that break down the dead bodies of plants and animals. So, microorganisms would be a good example of decomposers. Well, certain microorganisms, like bacteria, they can decompose things. They get rid of animal wastes and dead bodies of animals, and in doing so return the nutrients to the soil, which then can be used for new growth of plants. An example of a microorganism that does this is, an example of nutrients would be nitrates, which are formed from the breakdown of proteins in dead tissues and used by plants to form new cells. Phosphates also, as well, are needed for many vital functions in living bodies and are also recycled. And the cycling of these nutrients ensures a balance in ecosystems, as the processes that remove materials are balanced by the processes that return them. A similar cycle would be the carbon cycle. So carbon is a very important element for everything, because everything on Earth is based on carbon. And there's only a fixed supply of carbon on Earth, and life has to make do with this amount. So no extra comes in from the outside, so we need to recycle and renew the carbon. And this happens like so. So you have animals, and with respiration, carbon dioxide is put into the atmosphere. And then you also have animals that die and decay, and that goes to soil bacteria. So animals, bacteria. So animals both respire and produce CO2, and decay and give nutrients to the soil bacteria. From the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it allows photosynthesis for plants. I'll just draw a little tree there. Photosynthesis. And then the plants that are formed from photosynthesis can be fed to the animals. And then also the plants can decay as well, and that is given to the soil bacteria. And the soil bacteria also respire and form carbon dioxide. So that is the cycle, but then we, as humans, like to combust a lot of fuel for like our fires or just heating up our home or anything like that. You have coal and oil, which have quite large amounts of carbon in them, and then during manufacturing you use up that fuel and by combusting it for energy, and that combustion also produces carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that would be the entire carbon cycle. So carbon dioxide in the air is made into food by green plants in photosynthesis. Plants use the carbon dioxide to make carbohydrates, fats, and proteins which make up their bodies. Animals can then get their carbon by eating plants or other animals, and then animals use the carbon to make carbohydrates, fats, and proteins which make up their bodies. And then the plants and animals release carbon dioxide as they respire. Microorganisms also play a role in the carbon cycle because they also respire, so they also produce CO2, and they digest materials from their environment for growth and other life processes. These materials are returned to the environment either in waste products or when living things die and decay. So, as I said, animals and plants can decay, and that gives them those waste products. And when animals and plants die, the carbon in the dead animals and plants is released back into the atmosphere by the process of decay, as I said, and the bacteria involved release carbon dioxide when they respire. So soil bacteria also decay, but these do as well. When decay is prevented, like with fossil fuels, oil and gas are formed. Fossil fuels were made from, dead bodies of plants and animals millions of years ago, and they weren't completely decomposed, so a lot of the carbon was locked into the fossil fuels. Therefore, when fossil fuels are burnt, combustion takes place and the carbon is released as carbon dioxide, adding to the levels in the atmosphere. Humans have only just started extracting and burning fossil fuels in large quantities over the last 200 years, but it's disrupted the balance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and led to, it's just disrupted the balance of the cycle and added more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If you're doing higher T, you need to know about the nitrogen cycle, where nitrogen is recycled through the activity of soil bacteria and fungi. It's a very important element because it's needed for making proteins. There's not a lot of, there's a lot of nitrogen in the air. Air is mostly nitrogen, 78%. But because it's so unreactive, it can't be used directly by plants to make protein. only nitrates are useful to plants, so we're dependent on other processes to convert nitrogen to nitrates in the soil. So nitrogen in the air is changed into nitrates, which plants can absorb and use by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are found living freely in the soil and can also be found in the roots of one group of plants, the legumes, so peas, beans, and clover, in special structures called root nodules. All green plants take nitrate from the soil and convert it into their proteins and DNA. Animals eat plants, so the nitrogen in plant protein and DNA enters the food chain and becomes animal protein and DNA. The nitrogen is eventually returned to the soil in urine and feces from animals. Soil bacteria convert the urea in excrete waste to ammonia using the enzyme urease. When dead animals and plants decay, their nitrogen-containing compounds are also converted to ammonia, which cannot be used directly by plants. Nitrifying bacteria in the soil convert ammonia into nitrates, which is nitrification, which are then absorbed by the plants and the cycle starts again. In some conditions, denitrifying bacteria in the soil break down nitrates and return nitrogen to the air, which is called denitrification. This is usually in waterlogged soil or unplowed soil, so improving drainage reduces this effect, making soil more fertile. So this is sort of a graph showing you. So plants, through feeding, the nitrogen goes to the animals. Urea is broken down by urease, which is decomposition or decomposition. So it goes to ammonia. And the same for the plants, death and decomposition. And then through nitrification you get nitrates in soil. You can get absorption from the soil to the plants. And from the nitrates in the soil, through denitrification you get nitrogen in the air. And from nitrogen in the air you can get nitrogen fixation, and it goes back into the soil. So space is used by humans for, housing, industry, farming, and dumping of waste. So we require a lot of land for our growing population. However, because of our large population, we require a lot of space, a lot of energy, a lot of things. So that conflicts with the need for other animals and wildlife, because they also want space, and our combustion of fuels impacts the environment. We are just impacting nature, essentially. So we have ways to, help these, to help conserve wildlife while maintaining the human population, keeping us alive. So that's why whenever new roads or buildings are being built, or they're being considered, environmental impact assessments have to be carried out to decide whether the development should be allowed to go ahead or not, or just modified to reduce the effects on wildlife. So you have to collect some detailed, reliable scientific information from biologists to help you inform, manage, and reduce the impact of development on the environment by, minimizing disruption, by timing developments correctly, so avoiding the breeding season if you're doing things. Discovering if any rare or endangered species are present, which could affect whether the development goes ahead, because if you have an endangered species in the area you want to build on, you would not really want to build on the area anymore, so you can conserve that species. And you also need to investigate whether the effects on wildlife can be reduced by modifying the development or providing alternative habitats. Now, intensive farming is the latest technique on high yield productivity, because our population is growing, there's a rising demand for cheap food to prevent future shortages, so you have quite intensive compact farming that aims to get the maximum yield from the available land. sustainable intensive farming, intensive aquaculture, intensive livestock farming, and management intensive grazing fall under this farming category. Battery farming, where animals are kept in huge number in small space, is an environmental issue that some people have strong feelings about. It's just one example of intensive farming. Intensive farming is an agricultural process that aims to produce the maximum yield from the land available, and it applies to both animals and plants. There are some advantages to intensive farming. That's why they're doing it in the first place, because you have a yield that is higher compared to how much land you have to use. More livestock, animals, or crop plants can be kept, and conditions can be controlled. Therefore, the food is cheaper to produce and more profitable for the farmer. This, helps them stay in business. And if farms go out of business, then, well, the UK would be less self-sufficient in food. Also, if the production of the food is cheaper, then it's cheaper to buy as well. And by increasing the yield, it allows the UK to grow more food to meet the needs of a growing population. But the disadvantages are the chemicals used. For example, pesticides and antibiotics used to control disease in livestock could enter the human food chain and get into our bodies. Chemicals can cause pollution and harm wildlife other than pests. So if say you've sprayed pesticides on your plants and it's rained, you might get pesticides on other plants in the nearby area, and that can affect the wildlife and the ecosystem of the local area. Natural environments are also destroyed, like hedgerows are uprooted to make fields suitable for intensive farming. Intensive farming can cause animals distress and discomfort because they tend to have a poor quality of life. You do have some species of plants that indicate how polluted an area is. Those are called indicator species. So some pollutants are, solid or liquid chemicals like oil or detergent or fertilizers or pesticides, as I mentioned earlier. You get gaseous chemicals like carbon dioxide, methane, or chlorofluorocarbons, sulfur dioxide, which can also cause acid rain, and nitrous oxide. There's also human and animal sewage, noise pollution is a thing, as well as heat pollution, and you can also get non-recyclable household waste. And it's impossible to fully prevent pollution, but we need to limit the levels of pollution so they don't do so much damage on the environment. But you can judge the pollution of an area with indicator species. So those are living organisms that indicate the level of pollution by its presence or its absence. So lichens are used as indicators of air pollution because some lichen can be found in clean air, and some are found in areas polluted with nitrous oxides or sulfur dioxide. So, for, say, water quality, in clean water you have the species stonefly nymph and mayfly nymph, which are quite common. Low level of pollution, you have freshwater shrimp or caddisfly larvae. Moderate pollution, you see the water louse or bloodworm, and in high pollution you can see sludge worm and rat-tailed maggots. So there is a process called bioaccumulation, which is to do with heavy metals. So the main chemicals you need to be concerned about in terms of pollution are heavy metals and pesticides. Living things only need small quantities of metals, and too much can harm them. And some metals like lead or mercury are poisonous, even small quantities. Most heavy metal pollution is caused by industrial processes. There used to be a lot of lead pollution from vehicles burning petrol, but now petrol is lead-free, although leaded petrol is still used in some developing countries. Pesticides are poisonous chemicals that are used to kill agricultural pests, usually by spraying on crops. Some of them take time to break down, so traces of them can be found on fruits and vegetables in shops, And pesticides left in soil can also be washed into rivers and streams by rainfall. Pesticide sprays can drift in the air beyond the areas being sprayed. In the UK, there are controls on the use of these polluting chemicals. Some are banned in certain situations, and the Environment Agency monitors the environment to look for any signs of harmful levels of pollutants. Although there are occasional accidents causing high levels of pollution, the levels of these pollutants released into the environment are usually small and controlled. Problems arise, though, if these chemicals enter the food chain. So organisms at the top of any food chain would accumulate the highest level of any poison that enters the chain. As humans are at the top of the food chain, we are particularly at risk, because with bioaccumulation, heavy metals that are present in things like industrial wastes or pesticides, which cannot be broken down in animals' tissues, are washed into soils and rivers and pass through food chains. So if you have, say, a high amount of, let's say, lead in your cocoa plant, well, in the soil that your cocoa plant is growing in, then the cocoa plant can have a high level of lead in the cocoa, and when, well, not the best example ever, but, then it can be transferred into people. So, say if you had a bunch of lead in a water supply, then the plankton would be eating the lead that is in the water supply, and then, say, some sort of aquatic worm would eat a higher quantity of plankton, and then that amount of lead would build up. A fish would eat that quantity of a higher quantity of worms, so that lead is multiplying as that fish is eating it, and then another fish eats a few of those fish that have quite a big amount of lead in them, and then a person eats a fish. So then they're consuming a lot more lead than, would have initially been consumed by the plankton, which, that can eventually reach toxic levels, which can reduce fertility or cause death. So that's why we need to control our heavy metals and prevent pollution. Yeah. The last thing you need to know on this topic is eutrophication, which is the process by which pollution by fertilizers results in lowered oxygen levels in bodies of water. So, it's quite an interesting process, I think. It's not too difficult to wrap your head around, at least I find. So basically, sewers and fertilizers can get into streams and rivers from farmland, say if they're washed from the soil by rain, which causes runoff, and that starts the process of eutrophication, which can, kill fish and other animals. So, basically, the excessive nutrients from the fertilizers get flushed into the land, into the rivers from the land by rainwater, and then these nutrients increases the aquatic plant growth and algae and other plants. So you have the nutrients, and then that allows the plants to bloom better at the top. However, the algae blooms prevent sunlight from reaching other plants, so those plants begin to die as they can't photosynthesize. See these plants at the bottom. And then those dead plants are then decomposed by bacteria, which use up the oxygen in the water during respiration. So you have a higher quantity of bacteria in the water, so there's more food for them, and then they use up the oxygen in the water. And because there's a lowered amount of oxygen in the water, fish and other organisms can then suffocate because of it. So that's the process of eutrophication. There's not really that's all you need to know. So yeah, you have nutrients, allows algae to bloom at the top, which prevents sunlight going to the plants, and that the plants die because they can't photosynthesize. More bacteria is present because it has plants to decompose, and then because the oxygen is being used up from the respiration of the bacteria, then the oxygen is too low and the animals in the water can die. And that is all of ecosystems and nutrient cycles and human impact on the environment. There is also a practical. I don't really go through practicals though. You just need to know about... Was there a practical? I'm pretty sure there was. Let me look. Doesn't seem to be a practical. There is. And it's just investigating the action of urease on urea. Urease is an enzyme produced by bacteria in soil, and they use it to break down urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide. So you pour some of the urea into a test tube, attached a moist universal indicator paper on the hook in the cork so that it is suspended above the urea. And you add 5 centimeters cubed of 1% urease to the urea in the test tube and place it with the cork suspended with the suspended indicator paper as shown in the diagram, and you record your result and draw the conclusion. So the universal indicator will turn blue, indicating that ammonia was present as the urease broke down the urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide, and ammonia is alkaline, and that's why it turns blue. And that's it.